Hey everybody, welcome to the presentation on the American War for Independence, as world historians tend to refer to the American Revolution, which is really, I think in many respects, kind of an extension of what we talked about in class on Thursday and Friday, which is this movement towards the Enlightenment, this movement towards natural rights and liberties and republican forms of government, replacing monarchies and autocracies. And I think this picture represents this magnificently. These are the citizens of Boston in the summer of 1773, pulling over the lead statue of King George III that had stood there for more than a decade. And it was a symbol of the colonists kind of toppling the monarchy of the British state. So, what exactly did the founders believe? What is their relationship, the extension that they seem to have with the Enlightenment? Because a lot of the philosophers of the Enlightenment certainly had a great deal in common with the founders of the American Revolution. Frankly, you could make a very easy case that, that Jefferson and Franklin and John Adams were Enlightenment philosophers in and of themselves. Washington had a very unique set of ideals that was very heavily rooted in classical civilizations. Later figures such as James Madison and George Mason, also seem to have strong roots in the Enlightenment. So, what exactly did they believe? What exactly did they seek? And I want to start off with a passage from one of my favorite books, which is that one of the things that the founders and these Enlightenment philosophers had in common is a common Atlantic civilization. Now, if you kind of just think about that for a moment, obviously we're talking about civilizations that are bordering the Atlantic Ocean, and now they are having a great deal in common. England, France, certainly the 13 colonies. The men that are leading these civilizations, these societies, the women who are demanding reforms and increased rights, are really kind of speaking in many cases the same language. They're kind of using the same terminology. They seem to have many of the same ideals. Let's take a little bit of a look at it. These are some of the reforms that the founders, really, I think, sought as they were pursuing this. And we'll start down here at the very bottom left of this diagram. Now, we've all heard the phrase that Patrick Henry uttered, no taxation without representation. That was clearly a driving force behind America's movement towards independence. I think had the British granted the colonists seats in Parliament, they granted them, the opportunity to have representation, I think world history would have looked decidedly different. But ultimately, as it turns out, they didn't. And as the taxation began to increase in the colonies, the calls for voter representation and increased rights in American government started to take hold. This is also one of the backgrounds to a theory that, frankly, I tend to agree with, which is that the American Revolution was not revolutionary. What I mean by that is that revolutions produce huge, enormous, dramatic change. The American Revolution created an independence for the colonies. However, that colonial independence was based around governments that had been in practice in Virginia, in New York, in Massachusetts, etc., for well more than a century. So the colonists had a very long history of self-government, and they took full advantage of that. So this really wasn't as revolutionary as we make it out to seem. They wanted a clear expression of rights for British citizens in and out of England. This was one of the things, frankly, that really propelled the argumentation of the Bill of Rights in the mid-1780s. This was something that really a lot of people wanted at the end of the American Revolution prior to the Articles of Confederation period. And ultimately, we obviously get that in 1791 when the Bill of Rights was ratified. They were opposed to what they perceived as a despotic and corrupt British government, both at the parliamentary and at the royal level. King George, again, I refer to Hamilton. If you've ever seen the play Hamilton, check it out on Disney Plus. Put your Mandalorian aside and watch Hamilton. It's fantastic. But that musical does a great job of kind of capturing the perception of the time about King George. King George was viewed in a very poor light, frankly, in the colonies. Concern over a lack of representation. It wasn't just voting rights. It wasn't just having the opportunity to maybe seat members in the British Parliament. It was having the British Parliament take any notice of the colonies and to try to legislate on behalf of the colonies, even if there aren't colonial members, as there were, for example, Scottish and Welsh members of the British Parliament, which is what the colonies ultimately wanted. Even if you couldn't get full representation, if you could get the colonies to have some sort of a way to reach parliamentarians so that parliamentary practices would certainly reflect on colonial needs, because they didn't pay almost any attention to the colonies during the 1760s and 1770s. And this was part of a large, I think, a broader call that was happening in Britain at the time, which was, a lot of people wanted parliamentary reform. The House of Lords, their influence was waning. The House of Commons, their influence was growing. I think people wanted in England to have greater voting opportunities. Certain classes of people were prohibited from exercising their voting opportunities, and that isn't something that ultimately gets fixed until the 1830s. So the American colonies weren't really the only British group that was disenchanted with the English government at the time. So a little bit about the timeline of this. Obviously, you're going to take U.S. history next year, so we're not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the American Revolution and going through different acts, parliament and taxes and things like that. But just in terms of the big picture, a couple things to point out. First of all, you are probably familiar with the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War, which was fought over fur trading claims in the Great Lakes. This war required British defense of the colonies, and that came at a pretty steep price. And at this point, the colonies paid a lot of local taxes, but they didn't pay a great deal of British taxes. That's going to change in phase 2, where the opposition to these British taxes is going to increase. In order to recover the lost revenue and the cost of fighting the French and Indian War, the British Parliament began to levy a series of taxes on everything from sugar to stamps to hats to wool to iron to candles. You name it, it was taxed. And oftentimes these taxes were not put in the form of tariffs, but they were direct taxes that the colonists could see and that the colonists grew very angry about. The unrest eventually culminates in events like the Boston Tea Party, the boycott of British goods, to armed insurrection at Lexington and Concord. In the third period, this period of remarkable unrest in which groups like the Sons of Liberty rallied patriotic factions against loyalists to the British government, ultimately culminating in the last phase, which begins in 1776 after the Colonial Declaration of Independence, where the colonists are forced to fight a more affluent and well-armed British state. Frankly, you could argue that during the first several years of the American Revolution, the British were not really fully engaged with fighting the colonists. And ultimately, the French support of the colonial effort really started to turn the tide of that conflict, finally resulting in America's independence after the victory at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, certified by the Treaty of Paris. And America's first representative form of government is to follow the Articles of Confederation, which, as we know, was short-lived and will ultimately be replaced by the Constitution in 1791. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in class.